Picture the scene with care, because it reveals far more about how power actually works than any formal statement ever could. The cameras are active, the symbols of state are meticulously arranged, and the president speaks with unwavering confidence about strength, resolve, and America's position in the world. Yet something feels off. A chair remains unoccupied. A voice that should be present is notably absent. A figure who should command attention keeps slipping just beyond the frame. In Washington, silence is rarely incidental, distance is rarely accidental, and absence often speaks louder than open dissent. What is unfolding inside the Trump administration is neither a policy dispute nor a matter of scheduling. It is a deliberate recalibration by someone who understands that political survival often depends on knowing when not to stand too close to a potentially damaging decision. Vice President JD Vance is not challenging Donald Trump, nor is he openly resisting him. Instead, he is doing something more subtle and more consequential. He is edging sideways, creating enough separation to avoid responsibility if events unravel, while staying close enough to benefit if they succeed. Once you grasp why this matters, it becomes clear that the story is not truly about Venezuela, Greenland, or even Trump himself. It is about succession, positioning, and who is preparing for what comes next. In Washington, power rarely fractures with dramatic confrontations. It reveals itself through small adjustments, calculated quiet, and carefully managed visibility. That is precisely why the shifting relationship between President Trump and Vice President Vance deserves far more scrutiny than it has received. On the surface, the administration projects certainty and cohesion. But beneath that exterior, recent foreign policy decisions, especially those involving Venezuela and provocative rhetoric surrounding Greenland, have exposed internal tensions that many Republicans are no longer comfortable ignoring. When Congressman Don Bacon publicly condemned the suggestion that military force might be used to acquire Greenland, labeling offensive to allies and strategically irrational, he was doing more than criticizing a remark. He was signaling institutional alarm. Greenland is tied to NATO obligations, Danish partnership, shared military history, and decades of trust. Bacon's reaction reflected the voice of experience pushing back against symbolic displays of dominance divorced from strategic reality. This creates a dilemma for Vance. During the campaign, he built his political identity by criticizing interventionism, questioning elite consensus, and advocating restraint under an America First framework. That positioning now constrains him. Criticizing intervention while out of power is easy. Maintaining consistency when one's own administration crosses those boundaries is far harder. Under Trump, military actions have unfolded across multiple regions in a compressed time frame, directly clashing with Vance's earlier rhetoric. And this is where his silence becomes revealing. During major announcements related to Venezuela, moments that typically demand visible unity, Vance was noticeably absent. He did not appear beside the president, the Secretary of State, or the Defense Secretary. The White House moved quickly to explain this away, insisting that he was deeply involved behind the scenes through secure channels, framing his absence as operational prudence rather than political distance. But politics is not judged by internal explanations. It is judged by what the public sees. And publicly, Vance chose near invisibility. On economic policy, he remained outspoken and engaged, reinforcing areas that align neatly with his long-term image. On Venezuela, his engagement shrank to the bare minimum, resharing official statements without adding analysis, defense, or justification. In political communication, this is the lowest risk posture possible. Formal alignment without substantive ownership. This restraint is striking given Vance's reputation as one of the administration's strongest communicators. Analysts noted that when he eventually addressed the issue, his remarks felt defensive rather than persuasive, reactive rather than visionary. He raised a familiar question about whether the United States should allow a hostile regime to exploit regional resources, but avoided answering the harder ones. What is the end goal? Under what legal authority does this action operate? And how is success defined? Those omissions are not accidental. Venezuela poses particular danger for Vance because defending intervention there requires embracing either a prolonged military and economic commitment or promoting short-term gains that are unlikely to materialize. Claims that Venezuelan oil would meaningfully lower U.S. energy prices ignore how energy markets actually function. Extraction takes years, infrastructure must be rebuilt, and private corporations, not governments, control production and distribution with profit, not consumer relief, as their priority. Vance understands this, and that understanding makes enthusiastic defense risky. Adding to this risk is the broader Republican environment heading toward the 2026 midterms, where even high-profile figures have acknowledged that close association with Trump may increasingly carry political cost. Vance's response is not rebellion, but insulation. He projects independence and skepticism without severing ties to the movement that elevated him. Yet the image of Vance as a pure outsider does not fully withstand scrutiny. His rise was heavily supported by powerful figures in technology and finance, particularly those deeply invested in government contracting and deregulation, especially in emerging fields like artificial intelligence. His political survival serves not only personal ambition, but the interests of a broader network that benefits from a future leader aligned with minimal regulatory constraints. His selection as vice president reflected strategic calculation rather than ideological purity. Influential voices favored someone who would not facilitate institutional efforts to sideline Trump if circumstances shifted. Ironically, despite anti-establishment branding, the administration's policies have largely mirrored traditional Republican priorities, making Vance's quiet recalibration all the more necessary. He is not distancing himself out of disloyalty, but out of foresight. In a system where today's defender can become tomorrow's scapegoat, Vance is choosing ambiguity over entanglement, silence over overcommitment, and flexibility over rigidity. Whether this positions him as a future leader or exposes him as a calculated opportunist would depend on how current decisions are ultimately judged. What makes the Venezuela episode so volatile is not only the military action itself, but the unanswered questions surrounding it. Once the initial shock fades, politics becomes about accountability. And this is precisely where Vance's restraint appears less coincidental and more like instinct. The administration's messaging has been forceful yet incomplete, heavy on moral urgency, light on legal grounding and long-term planning. Supporters frame intervention as a stand against authoritarianism. Critics point out what is missing: legal justification, respect for sovereignty, and a realistic definition of success. Foreign policy failures rarely begin with bad intentions. They begin with unanswered questions leadership hopes will not be asked. Vance's brand, intellectually cautious, skeptical of elite assumptions, resistant to vague promises, collides directly with this narrative. Defending it fully would bind his credibility to outcomes that may never arrive. Opposing it openly would fracture his relationship with power. So he occupies a narrow space between, aligning just enough to avoid disloyalty, while withholding the rhetorical investment that would tie his future to the result. This pattern becomes even clearer when contrasted with his assertiveness on domestic economic issues, where he appears confident and fully committed. The difference is not access or workload. It is risk assessment. Venezuela represents a convergence of military escalation, legal ambiguity, and economic overpromising, a combination that has ended careers across parties. Beyond policy, a deeper recalibration is underway inside the Republican Party. Internal signals suggest that unconditional alignment with Trump may increasingly limit long-term viability. Vance, younger and more forward-looking, appears acutely aware of this shift. He is positioning himself as adjacent rather than inseparable, aligned in spirit, independent in judgment. This positioning matters even more when viewed through the interests that benefit from his future relevance. His ascent was not accidental. It was accelerated by patrons whose priorities extend beyond any single administration. For them, Vance represents a politician capable of advancing technology-friendly policies under the language of national renewal rather than corporate expansion. Maintaining distance from controversial military actions preserves his credibility with skeptics while keeping him viable for future leadership. His role now resembles less that of a traditional vice president and more that of a political option, kept flexible across multiple scenarios, able to inherit a movement without inheriting its liabilities. This does not make him uniquely cynical. It makes him representative of an era where power is exercised through positioning, networks, and narrative control as much as through formal authority. The real question is not what Vance believes, but whether ambiguity can sustain him indefinitely. Distance protects in the short term, but eventually demands clarity. By this point, it becomes clear that what is unfolding is not miscommunication or personality clash, but a deliberate long game, one that shows how modern power operates less through declarations and more through strategic absence, calculated silence, and careful survival.